Hello, my name is Elena Victoria Ashford, and I am 4 years old. I live in Boston, Massachusetts, where the autumn leaves dance through the historic streets, carrying stories of triumph and heartbreak that mirror my own journey. I am the founder and CEO of Ashford Community Development, a nonprofit organization dedicated to creating sustainable housing solutions for underprivileged families. But to understand how I became the woman I am today, I must take you back to Charleston, South Carolina, to a grand estate where Spanish moss hung like curtains over a childhood that began in love but descended into betrayal. If you've ever been betrayed by those you loved most, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. Hit that like and subscribe button if you're ready to hear how I finally stood up for myself after years of manipulation. Charleston in the early 1990s was a city of contrasts. Antebellum mansions standing proudly beside modern developments, where old money whispered secrets through wrought iron gates. My family lived in Magnolia Grove, a sprawling estate that had been in the Ashford family for 4 generations. The house itself was a masterpiece of Southern architecture, with white columns reaching toward the sky and wraparound porches where the scent of jasmine filled the evening air. My mother, Catherine Ashford, was the light of my world. She had flowing auburn hair that caught the sunlight like fire, and eyes the color of summer storms, gray-green and full of warmth. Catherine was not just beautiful, she was brilliant. She held a doctorate in literature from Vanderbilt University and spent her days writing children's books that taught lessons about kindness, courage, and the magic hidden in everyday moments. I remember countless afternoons curled up in her lap as she read me her latest stories, her voice bringing characters to life with such vivid detail that I could see them dancing in the shadows of our grand parlor. Mother taught me to fold origami butterflies from colorful paper, each one carrying a wish or a dream. "Elena, darling," she would say, her fingers gracefully creasing the delicate paper, "butterflies remind us that even the most difficult transformations can lead to something beautiful." Those butterflies adorned my bedroom window, catching the morning light and casting rainbow patterns across the walls. She also taught me to paint watercolors, to tend the gardens where magnolias bloomed in magnificent splendor, and to believe that every person, regardless of their circumstances, deserved dignity and respect. My father, William Ashford III, was a prominent real estate developer who had built Ashford Properties into one of the most successful firms in the Southeast. He was often traveling for business, but when he was home, he was completely present. I cherished our Sunday morning horseback rides through the estate's vast grounds, where he would tell me stories about our ancestors and the responsibility that came with the Ashford name. "Elena," he would say as we watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, "wealth is not about what you own, but what you give back to the world." Those golden years of my childhood felt infinite, filled with love, laughter, and the secure knowledge that I was cherished. But fate, as my mother once wrote in one of her stories, has a way of testing even the strongest foundations. When I was 9 years old, my mother was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. The word itself seemed too harsh, too brutal to be associated with someone so full of life and light. The months that followed were a blur of hospital visits, chemotherapy sessions, and watching the strongest woman I knew gradually fade away. I remember holding her hand as she lay in the hospital bed, her once vibrant hair now covered by a soft silk scarf I had chosen for her, purple with golden butterflies. "My darling Elena," she whispered on what would be our last conversation, her voice barely audible but her eyes still fierce with love, "you have a light inside you that no one can ever extinguish. Promise me you'll use it to help others find their way." I promised through my tears, not knowing then how prophetic those words would become. Mother's funeral was held in the estate's rose garden, surrounded by hundreds of the flowers she had lovingly tended. I stood between my father and my grandmother, Victoria, feeling as though the world had suddenly become too large and too cold. The months following her death were shrouded in a gray fog of grief that seemed to settle over Magnolia Grove like a perpetual storm cloud. My father, overwhelmed by his own sorrow and the demands of running his business empire, began traveling more frequently. I understood that work was his way of escaping the memories that haunted every corner of our home, but his absence left me feeling like a ghost wandering through rooms that had once been filled with warmth and laughter. Then, when I was 11, everything changed again. Father came home from a business trip to Atlanta with a woman named Veronica Sterling. Veronica was tall and statuesque, with platinum blonde hair styled in perfect waves and ice blue eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they observed. She wore designer clothing and expensive jewelry that caught the light with every movement, but there was something cold about her beauty, like a perfectly sculpted statue lacking any warmth or soul. "Elena, sweetheart," my father said, his voice carrying a forced cheerfulness that I had never heard before, "I'd like you to meet Veronica. She's going to be part of our family now." Veronica smiled, but it was the kind of smile that never reached her eyes, practiced and hollow. With Veronica came her twin daughters, Madison and Brooke, who were both 13, 4 years older than me and infinitely more sophisticated in their cruelty. Madison was the leader, with sharp features and a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. She had inherited her mother's calculating nature and seemed to take genuine pleasure in making others feel small. Brooke was quieter but equally vicious in her own way, preferring psychological manipulation to Madison's direct attacks. From the very first day they moved into Magnolia Grove, I knew my life would never be the same. Veronica immediately began redecorating the house, removing my mother's photographs and replacing them with abstract art that meant nothing to anyone. She had my mother's garden redesigned, claiming the roses were too sentimental, and replacing them with geometric hedges that looked more like a corporate landscape than a family home. "Elena, darling," Veronica would say in her syrupy southern accent that somehow managed to sound condescending, "you really must learn to adapt to change. Clinging to the past isn't healthy for a young lady." But every change felt like another piece of my mother being erased, another memory being painted over with Veronica's cold perfection. Madison and Brooke made no effort to hide their disdain for me. They called me the orphan when adults weren't listening and took particular pleasure in destroying the origami butterflies my mother and I had made together. Once I found Madison systematically tearing them apart in my bedroom, letting the colorful pieces flutter to the floor like fallen dreams. "Oops," she said with mock innocence when I discovered her. "I guess your precious butterflies can't fly anymore." When I tried to tell my father what had happened, he was already back on a plane to another business meeting, and Veronica simply smiled and said that children sometimes have accidents. The cruelty escalated over time. Madison and Brooke would hide my schoolwork, ensuring I would be unprepared for important tests. They told their friends at school that I was disturbed because I talked to my dead mother, twisting the innocent way I sometimes spoke to my mother's photograph into something pathological. They excluded me from family conversations and convinced Veronica to seat me at a separate table during dinner parties, claiming I was too young to understand adult discussions. But perhaps the worst part was watching my father become someone I no longer recognized. Veronica had a way of manipulating him that was both subtle and devastating. She would praise him constantly, telling him how brilliant and successful he was, while simultaneously planting seeds of doubt about my behavior and emotional stability. "William," I once overheard her saying, "I'm worried about Elena. She seems so angry and resentful. Perhaps she needs professional help to deal with her mother's death." These conversations always happened when she thought I couldn't hear, but the walls of Magnolia Grove carried sound better than she realized. School became my only refuge, but even there, Madison and Brooke's influence followed me. They spread rumors about my family's dysfunction, making it difficult for me to form friendships. I threw myself into my studies, particularly excelling in literature and history, subjects that allowed me to escape into other worlds and other times when life felt less complicated. I also began volunteering at the local community center, helping to serve meals to homeless families. It was there that I met Mrs. Dorothy Washington, an elderly African-American woman who had worked as a teacher for 40 years before retiring. She saw something in me that others seemed to miss, a potential for good that hadn't been crushed by the darkness surrounding my home life. "Child," she said one afternoon as we folded donated clothes together, "you got a light in you that shines even when you're hurting. Don't let nobody dim that light, you hear?" Her words reminded me of my mother's final message, and for the first time in months I felt a spark of hope. As I entered my teenage years, the situation at home continued to deteriorate. Veronica had gradually assumed control over all household decisions, from the menu planning to the staff hiring. She fired Mrs. Rose, the housekeeper who had worked for our family since before I was born, claiming she was too attached to the old ways. Mrs. Rose had been like a second mother to me, and losing her felt like another death in the family. My father, now completely under Veronica's influence, began making decisions about my future without consulting me. When I expressed interest in attending a summer writing camp that reminded me of my mother's passion for literature, Veronica convinced him that I should instead attend an etiquette school in Atlanta. "Elena needs to learn proper social graces," she told him over dinner one evening, her voice carrying that tone of authority she had perfected. "Writing is a lovely hobby, but she needs to prepare for her real future as a proper Southern lady." I was 15 when I discovered the truth about Veronica's intentions for our family. I had been looking for a book in my father's study when I accidentally knocked over a stack of papers from his desk. As I bent to gather them up, I saw several documents that made my blood run cold. There were legal papers discussing the transfer of Ashford Properties assets, correspondence with real estate developers about selling Magnolia Grove, and most shocking of all, a draft will that left everything to Veronica and her daughters, with only a small trust fund designated for my education. The papers revealed that Veronica had been systematically convincing my father to restructure his estate, arguing that I was too emotionally unstable to handle the responsibility of the family business. She had even suggested that I might be better served by being sent to a boarding school in Europe, far away from Charleston and any claim to my family's legacy. That night, I sat in my room surrounded by the few remaining origami butterflies that had survived Madison's destruction, and made a decision that would change the course of my life. I would not let Veronica steal my father's love, my mother's memory, or my family's legacy. But I was still just a teenager with no power, no money, and no legal standing to challenge her machinations. I began documenting everything, keeping a detailed journal of Veronica's manipulations, Madison and Brooke's cruelty, and the gradual changes being made to our family's assets. I also started reaching out to my father's oldest business associates, particularly his longtime lawyer, Harrison Montgomery, who had been a family friend since before I was born. Mr. Montgomery was a distinguished gentleman in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes that reminded me of my grandfather. When I approached him with my concerns about Veronica's influence over my father, he listened carefully and promised to look into the matter. "Elena," he said, his voice grave with concern, "your mother made me promise to look after you if anything ever happened to her. I intend to honor that promise." During my junior year of high school, I applied to several colleges with strong social work and urban planning programs, determined to build a career that would honor my mother's values of helping others. When I received an acceptance letter from Boston University with a full academic scholarship, I felt a surge of hope that I hadn't experienced in years. However, when I shared the news with my father, Veronica immediately intervened. "William," she said, her voice dripping with false concern, "Boston is so far away, and Elena is still so young and impressionable. Perhaps she should attend a nice local college where we can keep an eye on her." She suggested several smaller schools in South Carolina that, while perfectly respectable, didn't offer the programs I needed to pursue my dreams. The battle over my college choice became a microcosm of the larger war being waged for my father's soul. Veronica enlisted Madison and Brooke to support her position, claiming that I was being selfish and ungrateful for wanting to leave Charleston. They painted my desire for independence as a rejection of family values, conveniently ignoring the fact that they had never treated me as family in the first place. But this time I had an ally. Mr. Montgomery had been conducting his own investigation into Veronica's activities and had discovered several troubling inconsistencies in the financial documents she had been presenting to my father. Armed with this information, he scheduled a meeting with my father to discuss my college plans and, more importantly, the future of the Ashford estate. The meeting took place in Mr. Montgomery's law office on a rainy Thursday afternoon in March. I sat between my father and the lawyer, my hands trembling as Mr. Montgomery presented evidence of Veronica's attempts to manipulate our family's assets. There were forged signatures on transfer documents, unauthorized communications with potential buyers for Magnolia Grove, and a paper trail showing how she had been gradually isolating my father from his longtime advisors and friends. My father's face went through a series of emotions as he reviewed the documents: confusion, anger, betrayal, and finally, a deep sadness that seemed to age him 10 years in the span of an hour. "How could I have been so blind?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "Grief makes us vulnerable, William," Mr. Montgomery said gently. "Veronica took advantage of your pain and your love for Elena to manipulate your judgment. But it's not too late to make things right." The confrontation with Veronica that evening was explosive. When my father presented her with the evidence of her deception, she initially tried to deny everything, then shifted to claiming that she had only been trying to protect the family assets from my irresponsible behavior. Madison and Brooke stood behind their mother, their faces masks of shock and defiance. "You ungrateful little brat," Madison screamed at me, her composure finally cracking. "We gave you everything, and this is how you repay us?" But the evidence was overwhelming, and Veronica's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled. My father, awakening from years of manipulation, demanded that she and her daughters leave Magnolia Grove immediately. He also initiated legal proceedings to recover the assets that had been transferred without his full understanding. However, the damage to our relationship couldn't be undone overnight. Years of manipulation had created a distance between my father and me that would take time and effort to bridge. He was genuinely remorseful about his blindness to Veronica's true nature, but I was still hurt by how easily he had been turned against me. "Elena," he said one evening as we sat on the porch where my mother and I used to watch fireflies dance in the twilight, "I failed you when you needed me most. I let my grief cloud my judgment, and I'm not sure I can ever forgive myself for that." I looked at him, seeing for the first time in years the man who had taught me to ride horses and told me stories about our family's history. "Dad," I said, using the childhood name I hadn't spoken in years, "we both lost Mom. We both made mistakes. What matters now is what we do moving forward." That fall, I left Charleston for Boston University, carrying with me a suitcase full of clothes, my mother's journal filled with story ideas, and a small box containing the origami butterflies that had survived Madison's destruction. The drive north felt like a pilgrimage, each mile taking me further from the pain of my childhood and closer to the future I was determined to build. Boston was a revelation. The city's energy was intoxicating, students rushing between classes, activists organizing rallies on the Common, artists displaying their work in small galleries in the North End. For the first time since my mother's death, I felt like I could breathe freely. My dormitory room was small but cozy, with a window that looked out over the campus quad where ancient oak trees provided shade for students studying on benches below. My roommate was Jennifer Kim, a pre-med student from California with an infectious laugh and a work ethic that rivaled my own. We became fast friends, bonding over late-night study sessions and shared dreams of making a difference in the world. "Elena," she said one evening as we shared Chinese takeout while cramming for our respective exams, "you have this way of seeing solutions where other people only see problems. Have you ever considered going into urban planning or social work?" I had been majoring in literature, following in my mother's footsteps, but Jennifer's words made me reconsider my path. I began taking elective courses in sociology and urban studies, discovering a passion for understanding how communities form, evolve, and sometimes fail. The more I learned about housing inequality, urban poverty, and community development, the more I felt called to work in this field. My sophomore year, I changed my major to urban planning with a minor in social work. The decision felt like coming home to myself, combining my mother's compassion for others with my own analytical mind and desire for justice. I threw myself into my studies, participating in research projects that examined affordable housing initiatives in Boston's most underserved neighborhoods. It was during one of these research projects that I met Professor Sarah Chun, a renowned expert in community development who would become both a mentor and a second mother to me. Professor Chen had grown up in poverty in San Francisco's Chinatown and had dedicated her career to creating innovative solutions for urban housing challenges. "Elena," she said after reviewing one of my research papers on sustainable housing design, "you have a rare combination of analytical skill and genuine empathy. Have you thought about pursuing graduate work in this field?" Under Professor Chen's guidance, I began developing what would eventually become my master's thesis, a comprehensive plan for transforming abandoned urban spaces into thriving, sustainable communities. The work was challenging but deeply fulfilling, requiring me to balance economic realities with social needs and environmental concerns. My relationship with my father gradually healed during my college years. He visited Boston several times, and we slowly rebuilt the trust that Veronica's manipulation had damaged. He was genuinely proud of my academic achievements and began asking for my input on Ashford Properties' future projects. "Elena," he said during one visit, as we walked through Boston's Back Bay neighborhood, "I've been thinking about shifting the company's focus toward more socially responsible development. Would you be interested in leading that initiative after you graduate?" The offer was tempting, but I had already begun formulating my own plans. During my senior year, I started developing a business plan for a nonprofit organization that would focus specifically on affordable housing development in underserved communities. I wanted to create something that would honor my mother's values while addressing the urgent housing needs I had studied so extensively. After graduating summa cum laude from Boston University, I was accepted into the master's program in urban planning at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. The program was rigorous and competitive, but it provided me with the advanced skills and connections I would need to make my nonprofit vision a reality. My thesis project focused on a comprehensive redevelopment plan for a struggling neighborhood in Roxbury, one of Boston's most economically disadvantaged areas. Working with community leaders, residents, and local organizations, I developed a model that combined affordable housing with community services, green spaces, and small business development opportunities. The project caught the attention of several major foundations and impact investors, leading to my first significant breakthrough. The Thornfield Foundation, a philanthropic organization focused on urban development, offered me a grant to implement a pilot version of my Roxbury plan. At 26, with my master's degree in hand and funding secured, I founded Ashford Community Development. The name honored my family's legacy while clearly stating my mission: to develop communities that serve all residents, not just the wealthy. My father provided additional startup funding and served as an advisor, finally finding a way to channel his business expertise toward the values my mother had taught us both. The early years of running ACD were challenging but incredibly rewarding. We started small, renovating abandoned buildings into affordable housing units and working with local organizations to provide support services for residents. Each project was a learning experience, teaching me to navigate the complex web of city politics, community needs, and financial constraints that define urban development work. Our first major success was the transformation of an abandoned textile factory in Roxbury into a mixed-use development called Butterfly Commons, named in honor of my mother's origami butterflies and her belief in transformation. The project included 60 affordable housing units, a community health clinic, a daycare center, and spaces for local artists and small businesses. The grand opening of Butterfly Commons was one of the proudest moments of my life. Standing before a crowd of residents, city officials, and supporters, I thought about how my mother would have felt seeing her values translated into concrete action that improved people's lives. Community development, I said in my speech that day, is about more than just buildings. It's about creating spaces where people can flourish, where families can put down roots, and where dreams can take flight like butterflies in a garden. As ACD grew and took on larger projects, I never forgot the lessons learned during my difficult childhood. I made sure our organization operated with complete transparency, involved community members in every aspect of the planning process, and maintained a focus on serving those who needed help the most rather than those who could pay the most. By my 30th birthday, Ashford Community Development had completed 15 major projects across New England, providing homes for over 800 families and creating community spaces that served thousands more. We had won several awards for innovative design and community engagement, and I had been invited to speak at conferences across the country about our approach to inclusive development. But success couldn't completely heal the scars of my childhood, and I still struggled with trusting people completely. My romantic relationships tended to be brief and superficial, as I found it difficult to let anyone get close enough to potentially hurt me the way Veronica and her daughters had. Jennifer often urged me to seek therapy to work through these issues, but I was too focused on my work and too proud to admit that I still carried emotional wounds from my past. Everything changed 3 years ago when I received a phone call that I had been both dreading and expecting for years. My father, now in his 70s, had suffered a massive heart attack while reviewing plans for a new Ashford Properties project. He was rushed to Charleston's Medical University Hospital, where doctors worked frantically to save his life. I dropped everything and flew to Charleston immediately, my heart racing as I thought about all the conversations we had never finished, all the forgiveness that still needed to be spoken aloud. When I arrived at the hospital, I found my father in the cardiac intensive care unit, connected to machines that monitored every beat of his struggling heart. "Elena," he whispered when he saw me, his voice weak but his eyes bright with relief. "I'm so glad you're here. There are things I need to tell you, things I should have said years ago." We spent hours talking during the days that followed, finally addressing the pain and misunderstandings that had accumulated over the years. He apologized again for failing to protect me from Veronica's cruelty, and I apologized for the years when my anger had kept us from being as close as we should have been. "Dad," I said, holding his hand as machines beeped softly around us, "you were grieving and vulnerable. Veronica was a master manipulator who took advantage of your pain. What matters is that you finally saw the truth and acted on it." My father survived the heart attack, but his recovery was slow and incomplete. The doctors warned that his heart had been severely damaged and that another attack was likely within the next few years. Faced with his mortality, he began making plans to ensure his legacy would continue in the right hands. "Elena," he said one afternoon as we sat in the garden at Magnolia Grove, now restored to something closer to my mother's original vision, "I want you to take over Ashford Properties. Not as a gift, but because you're the only person I trust to run it according to the values your mother and I always believed in." I was touched by his offer, but I also knew that my life was in Boston, with ACD and the communities we serve there. After much discussion, we developed a different plan. I would inherit the company, but we would merge it with Ashford Community Development to create a new kind of development firm that combined the resources of a for-profit company with the mission of a non-profit organization. The transition was complex and required months of legal work, but it was completed just in time. 6 months after our conversation in the garden, my father suffered another heart attack, this one fatal. I was with him when he died, holding his hand and telling him about the latest families who had moved into our affordable housing projects. "Your mother would be so proud," were among his last words, and I felt a peace that I hadn't experienced since childhood, knowing that we had truly reconciled and that he understood the woman I had become. My father's funeral was held at St. Michael's Episcopal Church in Charleston, the same church where my parents had been married and where my mother's funeral had taken place 20 years earlier. The service was attended by hundreds of people, business associates, employees, community leaders, and many families who had been helped by our various projects over the years. As I delivered the eulogy, I spoke about my father's evolution from a traditional real estate developer focused primarily on profit to a man who had learned to value community impact above financial gain. I talked about the importance of forgiveness, both giving it and receiving it, and the way that pain can either destroy us or motivate us to help others heal. After the funeral, as mourners gathered at Magnolia Grove for the reception, I was surprised to see a familiar face among the crowd. Veronica Sterling, now in her 60s and showing the effects of years of apparent financial struggle, approached me with what looked like genuine humility. "Elena," she said, her voice lacking the predatory confidence I remembered from childhood, I know I have no right to be here, but I wanted to apologize for what I did to you and your father. I was selfish and cruel, and I've regretted it every day since. I looked at her, this woman who had caused so much pain in my life, and felt something I hadn't expected: pity. She looked tired and defeated, her former beauty faded and her expensive clothes replaced by a simple black dress that had seen better days. "Veronica," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I appreciate your apology, but I need you to understand something. The damage you caused wasn't just financial or legal. You tried to destroy the relationship between a grieving father and his daughter. You robbed us of years we can never get back." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know, and I'm sorry. I was so focused on securing my own future that I forgot Madison and Brooke were watching everything I did. I turned them into people I don't recognize anymore, and I can't forgive myself for that." I learned that Madison and Brooke had both struggled significantly since leaving Charleston. Madison had married and divorced twice, each time losing more of the settlement money from my father's estate to poor investments and expensive lifestyles. Brooke had developed a gambling addiction that had consumed most of her inheritance and led to her estrangement from her mother and sister. "They blame me for everything that went wrong after we left your father," Veronica continued. "And they're right to blame me. I taught them that manipulation and cruelty were acceptable if they served your purposes. I destroyed their character just as surely as I tried to destroy your relationship with William." Looking at her, I felt the last of my childhood anger finally release its grip on my heart. Carrying hatred for Veronica had been like carrying a poison that slowly damaged everything it touched. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about excusing her behavior or pretending the damage hadn't been real. It was about freeing myself from the burden of that anger. "Veronica," I said, placing my hand briefly on her shoulder, "I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. I hope you can find a way to forgive yourself and maybe help Madison and Brooke find their way back to being decent people." She thanked me through her tears and left the reception soon after. I never saw her again, but I heard through mutual acquaintances that she had moved to a small town in North Carolina and was working as a volunteer at a women's shelter, perhaps finally finding a way to use her life to help others rather than exploit them. In the weeks following my father's funeral, I worked with Mr. Montgomery and a team of lawyers to finalize the merger of Ashford Properties and Ashford Community Development. The new organization would be structured as a benefit corporation, allowing us to pursue both profit and social impact while being legally required to consider the welfare of all stakeholders, not just shareholders. The transition wasn't without challenges. Some of Ashford Properties' longtime clients were skeptical of our new mission-driven approach, worrying that we would sacrifice quality or profitability in pursuit of social goals. Several key employees left to join competitors who offered more traditional development opportunities. But the new direction also attracted talented professionals who shared our vision of responsible development. We hired urban planners, social workers, environmental specialists, and community organizers who brought fresh perspectives and innovative ideas to our projects. Our first major initiative under the new structure was the redevelopment of a struggling neighborhood in North Charleston that had been devastated by years of industrial pollution and economic disinvestment. Working with residents, environmental groups, and city officials, we developed a comprehensive plan that included environmental remediation, affordable housing construction, job training programs, and the creation of a community center that would serve as a hub for ongoing neighborhood organizing. The project, which we named Phoenix Rising, took 3 years to complete and required navigating complex environmental regulations, community politics, and funding challenges. There were times when I wondered if we had bitten off more than we could chew, but the dedication of our team and the enthusiasm of community residents kept us moving forward. The grand opening of Phoenix Rising was attended by over 1,000 people, including families who had lived in the neighborhood for generations and new residents who had moved in as the area transformed. Standing before the crowd, I thought about the origami butterflies my mother and I had folded together, and how they had symbolized the possibility of transformation even in the darkest times. Community development, I said in my speech that day, is ultimately about hope. It's about believing that no neighborhood is beyond saving, no family is beyond helping, and no dream is too small to matter. Today, as I write this story, Ashford Community Development has grown into one of the Southeast's most respected development organizations. We've completed over 50 projects, providing homes for more than 3,000 families and creating community spaces that serve tens of thousands of people. Our work has been featured in national publications, and I've been invited to testify before Congress about affordable housing policy. But the true measure of our success isn't found in awards or media coverage. It's found in the children playing in playgrounds we've built, the families cooking dinner in kitchens we've helped make affordable, and the small businesses thriving in commercial spaces we've created. It's found in the young people who've participated in our job training programs and gone on to successful careers, and in the elderly residents who can age in place with dignity because we've provided accessible housing options. My personal life has also found its balance. 2 years ago, I met David Rodriguez, a public interest lawyer who specializes in housing rights. We met at a conference on affordable housing policy, where his passion for justice and his gentle sense of humor immediately caught my attention. David understands the demands of my work because his own career is driven by similar values, and he's helped me learn to trust again in ways I didn't think were possible. We're planning to marry next spring in the garden at Magnolia Grove, surrounded by the magnolia trees my mother loved and the butterflies that still visit the flowers she planted. The house itself has been partially converted into a retreat center where nonprofits and community organizations can hold meetings and training sessions, ensuring that it continues to serve a purpose that would make both my parents proud. I've also begun writing again, working on a book about community development that combines practical advice with personal stories from our projects. The book includes a chapter about the importance of healing from childhood trauma, not just for personal peace but for the sake of the communities we serve. We can't give others what we haven't found for ourselves. Recently, I received a letter from Madison Sterling, now Madison Walker, after her second marriage. She had somehow tracked down my address and written to apologize for her behavior during our childhood. The letter was thoughtful and seemed genuine, acknowledging the pain she had caused and expressing admiration for what I had accomplished despite everything our families had put me through. "Elena," she wrote, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that seeing your success and the good you're doing in the world has inspired me to try to become a better person. I'm working with a therapist to understand why I became so cruel, and I'm volunteering at a local boys and girls club, trying to give something back to kids who might be going through what you went through." I wrote back, offering forgiveness and encouragement for her efforts to change. Carrying anger toward Madison and Brooke had been as pointless as carrying anger toward their mother. It only poisoned my own heart and prevented me from fully embracing the joy and peace I had worked so hard to build. Looking back on my journey from that traumatized 11-year-old girl to the woman I am today, I'm struck by how many times the path forward seemed impossible. There were moments when Veronica's cruelty felt overwhelming, when my father's distance seemed unbridgeable, when the challenges of building a non-profit organization appeared insurmountable. But each time I found the strength to continue by remembering my mother's words about the light inside me that no one could extinguish, and by focusing on the butterfly's lesson about transformation through difficulty. The origami butterflies that survived Madison's destruction still hang in my office, faded but beautiful, reminding me daily that even the most fragile things can endure if they're protected by love and determination. My story is far from over. There are more neighborhoods to transform, more families to serve, more injustices to address through the power of thoughtful development and community organizing. There are also personal milestones ahead: marriage to David, perhaps children of our own who will grow up understanding that privilege comes with responsibility, and that true success is measured by the help we give to others. But most importantly, I've learned that healing from trauma isn't a destination but a journey, and that the most powerful way to transform our own pain is to use it as fuel for helping others find their way from darkness to light. Every family that moves into one of our affordable housing units, every child who plays in one of our community centers, every elderly person who finds dignity in one of our senior housing projects is both a beneficiary of our work and a healer of the wounds that childhood inflicted on my heart. The butterflies my mother and I folded together were more than just paper and creativity. They were symbols of hope, transformation, and the beautiful things that can emerge from even the most difficult circumstances. As I prepare for bed each night in my brownstone apartment in Boston's South End, I often stand at my window looking out over the city lights and thinking about the journey that brought me here. The neighborhood itself tells a story of transformation. Once neglected and overlooked, it has become a vibrant community where historic architecture blends seamlessly with modern amenities, where longtime residents live alongside newcomers, and where small businesses thrive next to community gardens. This is the kind of transformation I work to create in every project we undertake at Ashford Community Development. It's not about gentrification that displaces existing residents, but about careful, inclusive development that strengthens communities while preserving their character and serving their actual needs. Last month, I received an invitation that brought my journey full circle in an unexpected way. The Charleston Historical Society asked me to speak at their annual gala about the restoration of Magnolia Grove and its transformation into a community resource. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same social circles that had once whispered about my family's troubles were now celebrating the way we had turned those troubles into something that serves the greater good. Standing at the podium in the ballroom of the Ocean House Hotel, looking out at an audience that included many of Charleston's most prominent families, I spoke about the importance of using inherited privilege responsibly and the way that personal healing can become a source of community healing. True legacy, I said that evening, isn't about preserving the past unchanged, but about honoring the best of what came before while adapting to serve the needs of the present and future. Magnolia Grove could have remained a monument to my family's wealth, but transforming it into a place where nonprofits and community organizations can gather and plan their work makes it a living memorial to values rather than just objects. After the speech, several audience members approached me with questions about our development model and requests for consultation on their own community projects. Among them was a young woman named Sarah Beth Morrison, whose great-grandmother had been one of my mother's closest friends during their college years at Vanderbilt. "Ms. Ashford," she said, her eyes bright with enthusiasm, "I've been following your work for years, and I'm wondering if you might be interested in a project my family has been considering. We own several historic properties in Savannah that have been sitting empty for decades, and we'd love to find a way to turn them into affordable housing while preserving their architectural significance." These are the conversations that energize me most, when people who have the resources to make a difference choose to use them in service of something larger than themselves. Sarah Beth and I spent hours over the following weeks developing a preliminary plan for the Savannah project, which could potentially provide homes for 150 families while creating a model for historic preservation that other cities could replicate. The work is challenging and sometimes frustrating, particularly when we encounter bureaucratic obstacles or community resistance to change. But every challenge is also an opportunity to innovate, to find new solutions, and to demonstrate that development can be both profitable and principled. One of our most recent projects has been particularly meaningful to me personally. We're working to redevelop a former textile factory in Lowell, Massachusetts, that closed in the 1980s and has sat abandoned ever since. The building's history parallels my own family's story in some ways. It was once the economic heart of a thriving community, but changing circumstances and poor management led to its decline and abandonment. Working with Lowell city government, local unions, and community organizations, we've developed a plan to transform the factory into a mixed-use development that will include affordable housing, artist studios, small business incubators, and a community college satellite campus offering job training programs in renewable energy and sustainable construction. The project has required us to navigate complex environmental remediation issues, historical preservation requirements, and the competing interests of various stakeholder groups. There have been heated community meetings, last-minute funding crises, and technical challenges that sometimes seemed insurmountable. But there have also been moments of pure joy and connection that remind me why this work matters. Like the afternoon when we hosted a community picnic on the factory grounds and watched children play where their great-grandparents might have worked decades ago. Or the morning when Maria Santos, a single mother who had been living in substandard housing with her 3 children, got the keys to her new apartment and called it the most beautiful place I've ever lived. These moments of human connection and transformation are what fuel my passion for this work, even during the most difficult times. They remind me that behind every statistic about affordable housing or community development, there are real families whose lives are being changed for the better. As Ashford community development has grown, I've also become more involved in policy advocacy, working with legislators and other advocates to push for systemic changes that will make affordable housing more accessible and sustainable development more feasible. It's frustrating work at times, dealing with the slow pace of political change and the influence of powerful interests that benefit from the status quo. But I've learned that change happens through persistent pressure applied at multiple levels: individual projects that demonstrate what's possible, community organizing that builds power among those most affected by housing inequality, and policy work that creates the structural conditions for broader transformation. Earlier this year, I testified before a congressional subcommittee about the need for increased federal investment in affordable housing, sharing stories from our projects to illustrate both the urgent need and the potential impact of well-designed programs. It was surreal to sit in that marble-columned hearing room, thinking about the scared 11-year-old girl I had once been and the confidence that comes from years of turning pain into purpose. The personal healing that has accompanied my professional success has been equally important to my overall well-being. Therapy, which I finally began 3 years ago at David's gentle encouragement, has helped me understand how my childhood experiences shaped my adult relationships and decision-making patterns. Dr. Patricia Williams, my therapist, helped me recognize that my tendency to overwork and my difficulty trusting others were both protective mechanisms I had developed to survive Veronica's manipulation and my father's emotional absence. Learning to set healthy boundaries, to ask for help when I need it, and to believe that people can love me without wanting to control or exploit me has been transformative. Elena, Dr. Williams said during one of our sessions, you've spent so much of your adult life proving that you're worthy of love and respect. But worthiness isn't something you earn through achievement, it's something you already possess simply by being human. That lesson has been particularly important as David and I have planned our wedding and talked about starting a family. The idea of having children once terrified me, knowing how much pain a parent's mistakes can cause and worrying that I might repeat some of my father's errors. But I've come to understand that awareness of these pitfalls is actually protection against them, and that the love David and I share provides a foundation strong enough to support the challenges and joys of raising children. Our wedding planning has also given me an opportunity to reconnect with extended family members I had lost touch with during the difficult years with Veronica. My father's sister, Aunt Margaret, has become a cherished friend and advisor, sharing stories about my mother that I had never heard and helping me understand family traditions I want to continue. Your mother always said that love wasn't just a feeling, but a series of choices, Aunt Margaret told me one afternoon as we planned the wedding ceremony. Every day we choose whether to act with kindness, generosity, and forgiveness, or to let fear and selfishness guide our decisions. You've chosen love over and over again, Elena, even when it would have been easier to choose bitterness. These conversations with family members have helped me see my parents' relationship and my mother's character in new ways. I've learned that my mother struggled with depression during the early years of her marriage, and that my father's deep love for her was what helped her find the strength to become the vibrant, creative woman I remember. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but it was built on mutual respect, shared values, and a commitment to growing together rather than apart. Understanding this history has helped me appreciate the foundation David and I are building for our own marriage. We've chosen to wait until after the wedding to start trying for children, wanting to establish ourselves as a family unit first. But we've already begun talking about the values we want to instill in our future children: compassion for others, responsibility to community, the importance of using privilege to help those with less, and the understanding that true strength comes from vulnerability and honesty rather than from power over others. The wedding itself will be a celebration not just of David's and my love, but of the community that has supported us both through our individual journeys and brought us together. We've invited families from our housing projects, colleagues from our respective organizations, and friends from every stage of our lives. Professor Sarah Chen will officiate the ceremony, having become ordained specifically for this purpose, a gesture that moved me to tears when she offered. Mr. Harrison Montgomery, now in his 80s but still sharp and engaged, will walk me down the aisle, representing both my father's memory and the principle that family is created through love and commitment rather than just biology. The reception will be held in the garden at Magnolia Grove, where my mother's roses have been carefully restored and new plantings have been added to create spaces for dancing, dining, and quiet conversation. We've asked guests to make donations to a scholarship fund we're establishing for students from low-income families who want to pursue careers in social work, urban planning, or community development, rather than giving us traditional wedding gifts. As I write these final words of my story, I'm sitting in my office at Ashford Community Development, surrounded by photos from our various projects and the origami butterflies that have traveled with me through every stage of my journey. Tomorrow, I'll review architectural plans for our newest project, meet with city officials about zoning changes that could enable more affordable housing development, and interview candidates for our new position focused on environmental sustainability. But tonight, I'm reflecting on how far I've traveled from that frightened child who felt like a stranger in her own home to the confident woman who has learned to transform pain into purpose and isolation into community. The journey hasn't always been easy, and there are still days when old wounds ache or new challenges feel overwhelming. However, I've learned that resilience isn't about avoiding pain or pretending that trauma doesn't leave lasting effects. True resilience comes from learning to carry our scars with grace, to use our struggles as sources of empathy for others, and to believe that even the most difficult experiences can become stepping stones toward something beautiful and meaningful. My mother's origami butterflies taught me that transformation is possible even when it seems impossible, that beauty can emerge from the most fragile materials, and that with patience and care, we can reshape even the most challenging circumstances into something that lifts the spirit and serves the greater good. This is the legacy I hope to leave, not just the buildings we've constructed or the families we've housed, but the demonstration that healing is possible, that forgiveness is powerful, and that love, expressed through service to others, can indeed transform the world one community at a time. The butterflies still hang in my window, catching the morning light and casting rainbow patterns across my desk as I work. They remind me daily that my mother's love continues to guide me, that my father's eventual recognition of his mistakes led to redemption, and that even Veronica's cruelty ultimately served to strengthen my commitment to justice and compassion. As I prepare to begin the next chapter of my life as David's wife and potentially as a mother myself, I carry forward the lessons learned through struggle and the knowledge that every ending is also a beginning, every transformation requires both courage and patience, and every life has the potential to become something beautiful if we're willing to do the difficult work of healing, growing, and serving something larger than ourselves. The story continues, but this chapter ends with gratitude, for the pain that taught me empathy, for the challenges that built my strength, for the love that sustained me through the darkest times, and for the opportunity to spend my life helping others discover that they too can transform their circumstances and create something beautiful from even the most difficult beginnings.